Under your feet, there is a fire that has been burning since 1962. Not a metaphor, a real fire, hidden inside abandoned coal seams beneath Centralia, Pennsylvania, slowly eating the ground from below. Scientists and officials have warned that it could burn for centuries. Smoke once slipped through cracks in the pavement. Carbon monoxide rose from the earth, trees died from the roots, roads buckled, homes were condemned. And the town, little by little, but emptied out. But Centralia is not the only American town that was swallowed by the thing that created it. Across the United States, there are thousands of places classified as ghost towns, near ghost towns, abandoned settlements, and half-living ruins. Some were built on gold, some on coal, some on railroads, some on tourism, some on river traffic, some on a single industry that promised forever, then vanished. This is not a story about 10 places that simply got unlucky. This is a story about a pattern. Booms create towns, busts bury them. And today we are counting down 10 American towns that once believed the future would never end until the future packed up and left. Number 10. Elkmont, Tennessee. Deep inside the Great Smoky Mountains, hidden among trees, mist, and old wooden porches, Elkmont looks less like a town and more like a summer memory that forgot to die. In the early 20th century, this was not a ruin. It was a retreat. Wealthy families from Tennessee, Georgia, and across the South came here to escape the heat, join clubs, throw parties, hunt, socialize, and build mountain cabins that felt private, rustic, and permanent. The Appalachian Club and other resort communities turned the forest into a playground for people who believed the good years would keep returning every summer. But then, the Great Smoky Mountains National Park changed everything. The land was gradually absorbed into the park. Owners were given leases, many of them lasting for decades. Most of those leases expired in 1992, and the last resident left in 2001. After that, Elkmont became something strange, not fully erased, not fully alive. A historic district inside a national park. Some cabins were preserved, some were lost. Some stood abandoned long enough to look like the forest was slowly taking them back. What remains is not a classic mining ghost town. It is quieter than that. Elkmont is the ghost of leisure, a place where the rich built summer houses in the woods, only for time and public land to reclaim the invitation. Number 9. Thurmond, West Virginia. If Elkmont was built on escape, Thurmond was built on motion. At the height of the coal age, this tiny town along the New River was one of the most important railroad points in West Virginia. Coal came down from the mountains. Trains came through the gorge. Money moved through the depot. In the first decades of the 20th century, Thurmond generated enormous revenue for the Chesapeake and Ohio Railway. 15 passenger trains came through town each day. Its depot served tens of thousands of passengers a year. Hotels overflowed. Banks were rich. Saloons stayed busy. Coal barons passed through. Workers filled the streets. For a town with only a few hundred permanent residents, Thurmond punched far above its weight. It was not big because many people slept there. It was big because the railroad needed it. And that was the weakness. When steam locomotives gave way to diesel, Thurmond lost part of its reason to exist. When coal declined and roads took more traffic away from rail, the town lost more. Stores closed. Hotels burned or disappeared. Families moved out. The depot stayed, but the old world around it thinned into silence. By the 2020 census, only 5 people lived in Thurmond. Trains can still pass through, but the town is no longer the beating heart of a coal railroad economy. It is a preserved fragment, a place where the scale of the past feels almost impossible compared with the emptiness of the present. Number 8. Rhyolite, Nevada. Some towns die slowly. Rhyolite burned bright, then disappeared almost before the dust settled. In 1904, prospectors Shorty Harris and E.L. Cross found gold near the edge of Death Valley. The news spread with the speed of fever. Men rushed into the Nevada desert carrying tools, money, hunger, and the oldest American fantasy, that a single strike could turn nothing into a city. Rhyolite exploded into existence. At its peak, it had several thousand residents, with some estimates around 3,500 to 5,000. There were hotels, restaurants, saloons, a school, a hospital, a stock exchange, rail connections, electric lights, newspapers, and a 3-story bank building that looked absurdly confident standing in the desert. Rhyolite was not built like a temporary camp. It was built by people who thought the boom would last. But gold rush towns are promises written in dust. The panic of 1907 weakened investment. The mines failed to live up to the wildest expectations. Ore values declined. Investor pulled out. People left almost as fast as they had arrived. By the 1910s, Rhyolite was already collapsing into abandonment. Today, the Cook Bank ruins still stand, roofless and exposed, one of the most photographed ghost town structures in the American West. It looks like a monument to confidence gone bankrupt, a city that tried to become permanent before it had earned the right. Number 7. Kennecott, Alaska. Kennecott was not a gold town. It was a copper town, built in one of the most remote and dramatic landscapes in North America. In the mountains of what is now Wrangell St. Elias National Park and Preserve, prospectors found one of the richest copper deposits in the American West. To extract it, companies built not just mines, but a whole industrial world. Railroads had to cross wilderness. A mill town rose beneath the mountains. A massive red processing mill climbed the slope like a wooden machine. From 1911 to 1938, Kennecott processed nearly $200 million worth of copper. At peak operation, around 300 people worked in the mill town, with another 200 to 300 in the mines. There was a school, a hospital, a recreation hall, a skating rink, and company-controlled order in the middle of the Alaskan wilderness. For a while, Kennecott felt like proof that industry could conquer distance itself. But the ore body was finite. The best copper was removed. The economics changed. In 1938, the operation shut down. Workers left. The last train carried people away. The buildings remained because removing them was harder than abandoning them. Today, the Red Mill still stands against mountains and ice, preserved as a National Historic Landmark. Kennecott feels different from many ghost towns because its scale is still intact. It does not look like a village that faded. It looks like an industrial machine switched off in the middle of the wilderness, waiting for a shift that will never begin. Number 6. Cairo, Illinois. Cairo was not built on a mine, it was built on geography. The city sits at the meeting point of the Ohio and Mississippi rivers, one of the most strategic river locations in the American interior. On paper, it should have become one of the great cities of the Midwest. In the 19th century, investors imagined commerce, boats, warehouses, railroads, banks, hotels, and growth. Cairo was promoted as a kind of golden hope, but not everyone believed the dream. When Charles Dickens passed through, he saw disappointment, mud, sickness, and speculation gone sour. For a time, though, Cairo did grow. By 1920, its population reached 15,203. It had river traffic, railroads, a downtown, grand homes, commercial buildings, and the confidence of a city that thought location alone could save it. But location was not enough. River trade changed. Rail and road networks shifted power elsewhere. Industry weakened. Then racial conflict, white flight, poverty, and political failure tore deeper holes in the city. Cairo did not suffer one clean disaster. It suffered a long unraveling. Businesses closed, residents left, downtown hollowed out. The population fell to 1,733 by 2020. For years, the city even struggled without a full-service grocery store, a brutal symbol of how far an important river town had fallen. Cairo is not fully abandoned. People still live there. That makes it more painful. It is not a dead town preserved behind a park sign. It is a living city surrounded by the architecture of what it used to be. Number 5. Times Beach, Missouri. Times Beach is the ghost town that was not merely abandoned, it was erased. It began as a modest community near the Merrimack River, once promoted as a getaway along Old Route 66. By the 1970s, more than 2,000 people lived there. The town had a problem that seemed ordinary: dusty roads. Cars kicked up clouds of dirt. The solution seemed cheap. Waste oil was sprayed on the roads to keep the dust down. But that oil was contaminated with dioxin, one of the most dangerous toxic compounds associated with industrial chemical waste. Then came the flood of 1982, spreading the contamination and turning a local problem into a national disaster. In 1983, the EPA recommended permanent relocation for the town's more than 2,000 residents. The federal government began a buyout. Families left. Homes were emptied. The town was disincorporated in 1985. Eventually, the buildings were removed, and the land was transformed into Route 66 State Park. Today, grass grows where the town once stood. Visitors can pass through without realizing that an entire community was chemically condemned beneath that landscape. Times Beach is terrifying because there are almost no ruins to film. The absence is the ruin. Number 4. Gilman, Colorado. Gilman sits high in the Rocky Mountains above the Eagle River, a mining town perched in a place so dramatic it almost looks staged. Mining began in the area in the late 1870s, with gold, silver, lead, zinc, and later copper all pulled from the mountains. For decades, Gilman was tied to the Eagle Mine and the metals beneath it. The town had homes, a school, company buildings, and the strange confidence of a place built on extraction. By 1970, the mines had produced millions of tons of ore. But the wealth came with a cost hidden in the water and rock. Mining waste contaminated the area with heavy metals, including lead, zinc, cadmium, and arsenic. Copper-silver production continued until 1984, when mine workings were allowed to flood. The Eagle Mine area later became a Superfund site. Gilman was abandoned quickly, not because the scenery failed, but because the ground and water had been poisoned by the same industry that had created the town. Today, Gilman remains closed off, watched by no trespassing signs, sitting above the valley like a beautiful wound. It is one of the most visually striking ghost towns in Colorado, and one of the clearest reminders that extraction does not end when the last shift goes home. Sometimes the mine keeps working on the landscape long after the miners are gone. Number 3. Picher, Oklahoma. Picher was once part of one of the most productive lead and zinc mining districts in the world. During the 20th century, the metals pulled from this region helped supply American industry and war production. But the mining left behind a poisoned geography. Enormous piles of mining waste called chat rose around the town like artificial hills. Dust blew through neighborhoods. Soil was contaminated. Children were exposed to lead. The ground itself was unstable because so much of it had been hollowed out by mining. Picher became part of the Tar Creek Superfund disaster, one of the most notorious environmental catastrophes in the United States. A 2006 Army Corps of Engineers study found that 86% of Picher's buildings were undermined and could collapse. Then, in 2008, an EF4 tornado tore through the town and destroyed about 150 homes, accelerating an exodus that was already underway. In 2009, the state of Oklahoma officially disincorporated Picher. The population fell from 1,640 in 2000 to just 20 by 2010. What remains is not the romantic ghost town of Western movies. It is a poison town, a place where the danger is not only in the broken buildings, but in the dust, the soil, and the empty spaces beneath your feet. Picher is what happens when a town gives the nation its minerals and receives a toxic inheritance in return. Number 2. Bodie, California. Bodie is one of the most famous ghost towns in America because it feels frozen rather than simply abandoned. Gold was discovered in the Bodie Hills in 1859, but the real boom came later. By the late 1870s, Bodie had become a roaring mining town, with roughly 8,000 people at its height. It had saloons, gambling halls, mills, stores, homes, churches, and all the violence and hunger of a Western gold rush town. People came for fortune, and many found only dust, danger, and disappointment. Still, the mines produced enormous wealth, and Bodie became legendary for its lawlessness and intensity. Then, as with so many mining towns, the ore declined, investment shifted, fires damaged the town, and people left. By the 20th century, Bodie had become a remnant, but unlike many ghost towns, it was not rebuilt into a theme park or completely restored into a polished tourist fantasy. In 1962, California designated Bodie as a state historic park and preserved it in a state of arrested decay. That means the buildings are stabilized but not made new. Interiors remain much as they were left, stocked with objects, furniture, goods, and traces of daily life. Walking through Bodie feels like entering a town that has not died all at once, but has been held at the exact moment of disappearance. It is not pretending to be alive. It is preserving the dignity of decay. Number 1. Centralia, Pennsylvania. Centralia is the most famous burning town in America. In 1962, a fire connected to a trash burn near an abandoned mine spread into the anthracite coal seams beneath the borough. At first, life continued. People still lived above it. The town still had homes, streets, churches, and routines. But underground, the fire kept moving. It released gases. It heated the ground. It cracked pavement. It created dangerous voids. In 1981, a boy named Todd Domboski nearly fell into a sudden sinkhole, a moment that became a symbol of how unstable the town had become. Eventually, relocation became the answer. Homes were bought out or condemned. Most residents left. The population fell from around 1,000 in 1980 to just 5 in 2020. The old section of Route 61 became known as Graffiti Highway after it was closed and covered in paint, but even that symbol of ruin was buried in 2020 to keep visitors away. Centralia is not the only underground coal fire in the world. That would be false. But it is one of the most infamous, because here the fire did not merely burn beneath empty land. It hollowed out a town. It turned ordinary streets into warnings. It made the ground itself untrustworthy. And it may keep burning for centuries. 10 towns, 10 endings. But if you look long enough, the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Elkmont believed summer would return forever. Thurmond believed coal and rail would always rule the gorge. Rhyolite believed gold could turn desert into permanence. Kennicott believed copper could conquer wilderness. Cairo believed geography would guarantee greatness. Times Beach believed a small town could solve a dusty road without waking a chemical nightmare. Gilman believed the mine would feed the town without poisoning the mountain. Picher believed the minerals under the ground were worth more than the ground itself. Bodie believed the gold rush would keep roaring. Centralia believed the earth under its feet was solid. Each one was wrong in a different way. That is what makes ghost towns so unsettling. They are not only places where people used to live, they are places where certainty went to die. Every theater, depot, cabin, mill, church, school, and empty street says the same thing. People once stood here and believed tomorrow would look like today. They built as if the boom was permanent. They invested as if the mine would never run out. They raised children as if the railroad would never leave. They bought homes as if the river, the factory, the ore, the coal, the tourists, or the road would always be enough. And then one day, the thing that made the town necessary stopped being necessary. The money moved. The jobs left. The ground poisoned itself. The fire spread. The industry collapsed. The map stayed the same for a while, but the life underneath it was already gone. America did not lose these towns in one war or one disaster. It lost them through a series of bargains that looked profitable at the time. Take the gold, cut the timber, dig the coal, pull the copper, spray the road, build beside the river, trust the railroad, believe the company, believe the boom, believe that no empire ends while you are still living inside it. But every ghost town is proof that empires do end. Not always with explosions, sometimes with a final train, a closed mine, a school board vote, a buyout letter, a no trespassing sign, a buried road, a cabin left to the trees, a main street with no reason to open in the morning. And the real question is not why these places died. The real question is how many places today are still alive, only because the boom has not ended yet.